Hey,
Yeah, it's the
Maria,
same.
I downloaded that, the study guide. What page are you going to be on?
I'm on I don't know what, it's page 11. So
Okay.
it's 10 and 11.
Okay.
So the icebreaker question is has anybody ever had the opportunity to meet someone famous, and what was it like? Was it everything you expected it to be?
I've met one person that I considered famous. It's Ed White. Any of y'all remember who he was?
Yeah, he was on the Tonight Show.
No, Ed
No.
White, he was the first American astronaut to walk in space.
Oh,
Wow.
And he is the only person that I've ever asked for his autograph, because he's the only person I have ever met that impressed me.
wow.
Wow, yeah.
And it was at a dinner in Dallas. And they had a reception line you could go through. And I took my little program that had his picture in it and asked for his autograph. He impressed me. So that's the only famous person I've ever met. I've met some politicians. I didn't consider them famous.
Maybe infamous, right? But not
Infamous,
famous.
yes. Yeah, very much so. But Ed White was impressed me. So takes a
Awesome.
impress me.
I got to drive Dick Vermeil around a golf course one golf
Dick
tournament
Vermeil.
a couple of years ago. Yeah. Super Bowl winning coach.
Yeah,
Okay,
football
okay, yeah,
coach.
yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah, and he was really a delight. It was right before Sam and Andy graduated from high school. So he's trying to give me all these tips, don't let him join a fraternity. Let me tell you what happened with my son. And super nice guy. Gave me a cell phone number. If you're ever in California, please come and call. And anyway, he was just a delightful guy.
That's very cool.
I appreciate that Carol mentioned astronauts, because it reminds me that, yeah, I had pizza with an astronaut
Yeah.
at his next door neighbor's house. I don't think of him as famous though, because I worked for his son for 15 years.
It was
Wow.
John McBride, who's also an astronaut.
John
Yeah.
McBride was a space shuttle pilot.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Kim and I grew up in we're product of Clear Creek High School. We went to school with all the astronaut kids.
Yeah, right. You would have.
We went to church with the astronaut families.
Mhm.
They were just really cool people.
Yeah.
Always fun on bring your dad to work day. They always
Yeah.
had cool toys.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, I think mine was, for a number of years, the companies I worked for would sponsor trade shows. And so we'd have big names come in, a lot of sports guys. But I think the one that really impressed me the most was Colin Powell. And it was a very intimate luncheon, and he gave a speech. He talked at it, and he was just so impressive. And my favorite memory though was when he talked about how he was kept out of trouble as a child, and he said, I think he might have grown up in Harlem, and you could all the moms in the area could look out and see their kids playing around, and he said, I was never far from the eyes of an ant. And he said, so I didn't grow up in the age of the internet. I grew up in the age of the anti-net, or the auntie-net. So anyway, we're going to talk about we're going to read Matthew 21, 1-11, and it's about Jesus's riding in on the donkey into Jerusalem, and kind of what people expected and what they got. So would anybody like to do the reading? It's Matthew 21, 1-11. And it'll sound very familiar, Carol and Robin.
I'm sorry, could you repeat it again?
It is Matthew 21, 1-11. Anybody like to
do it.
read?
21:1.
You should do it.
I don't have my glasses. I'm sorry.
I know.
I'll read it.
Okay, go ahead, Paul.
I don't have my glasses either, but we'll do our best.
You can use mine.
When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee."
Okay, let's watch our little video here. Let me. Your screen. This is entitled "Undermining the Establishment."
The writer of 2 Kings tells us in chapter 9 that when God appoints Jehu as king of Israel, the people respond with unbridled enthusiasm. I can imagine the scene, can you? The Hebrew fathers lifting up their young children in the air and on their
Sorry.
shoulders so they can get the best view possible of their new king. I can also imagine some of the Hebrew mothers pulling aside their older children and asking them to cut down a few branches or find something symbolic they can wave in the air as Jehu walks by. 2 Kings chapter 9 says that as soon as Jehu is anointed as king of Israel, people begin blowing their trumpets and begin to yell out, "Jehu is king, Jehu is king." In this moment, the people are contagiously excited, but they also are most likely a little frustrated. They have had very little time to prepare. Their new king is coming towards them, and there's no time to plan, no time to roll out the red carpet, so to speak. So if you're in the crowd that day, you're trying to think fast on your feet. What can I do to show my utmost respect for this new king? All of a sudden, a few people next to you begin taking off their cloaks, their outer garments, their jackets, and start laying them on the ground so the king has a proper place to walk. Now, this was a big deal. This act of laying down their cloaks was a very big deal. It's not like these people had a huge closet full of clothes and cloaks to choose from in the event that their current one might get ruined. Everything they wore was made by hand. They didn't have large wardrobes, so chances are they're laying down the only cloak they have. And it's probably the most expensive article of clothing they own. But in this moment, they will do whatever they have to do to show this new king the respect he deserves. So they take off their cloaks as a symbol of the best they have to offer in the moment, and they lay it down before the king as he walks by. And when he walks by, they shout for joy. Jehu's anointed king, and the people respond suddenly in celebration. Now we can see this kind of public celebration not just within the writings of Hebrew history, but also throughout Greco-Roman history. Whenever a king or a general or an emperor came back from victory on the battlefield, they were welcomed back into the capital city with this massive kind of frenzy. These conquering heroes, along with a military entourage of many, would ride arrogantly into town, pompously on their prized stallions or on their gold-plated chariots. The trumpets would sound, people would shout praises and throw flowers, branches, and clothing in the road as their conquering hero went by with his chest sticking out and an aloof wave of his hand. So just like the account in 2 Kings, we know that the Roman crowds honored their conquering heroes dramatically as well. Now we can also see this kind of public celebration in this passage today, can't we? Only this time, it's a little different. The conquering hero entering town isn't an official ruler of the people with an official recognized title like emperor or general, or even king of Israel. Herod owns that title for the time being. The hero of this story doesn't have an official title, at least not in the eyes of the ruling and religious establishments. But the response to Jesus is equally amazing as he rides into Jerusalem. The people see Jesus coming into the city of Jerusalem and they go crazy. Children are on the shoulders of their dads and on the hips of their mothers to get the best view possible. Once again, people are waving palm branches in the air. And like the crowd around Jehu, the people in this crowd also take off their cloaks and place them in Jesus' pathway as they shout praises to him. We can see very clearly from their reaction to his entrance into the city that this crowd in Jerusalem wants Jesus to take over the city, take over Israel, and take over the Roman Empire. They want to make Jesus king on the spot because they want him to use his miraculous power to shatter Roman rule and free them from their oppressions. So when Jesus makes his entrance, they go wild. They see him as king. And not only do they see him as king, they actually refer to him as the son of David. Well, this whole thing is revolutionary. First, it's revolutionary because the whole city is stirred up when Jesus comes into town. But even more revolutionary is the fact that people actually call Jesus the son of David, which means they believe him to be the rightful heir to David's throne, the real king of Israel, who will undermine all tyrannical establishments and whose throne will endure forever. And what's especially amazing about this whole thing is the fact that Jesus not only welcomes this public celebration and affirmation of who he really is, he actually encourages it. In Luke's gospel account, when told by the Pharisees to silence these people, Jesus says, if they keep quiet, even the rocks will cry out. You have to admit, this is a very triumphant and revolutionary entrance here. But wait a minute, something's out of place. Something seems a bit off, especially to the Roman citizens in the crowd. What is it? It's the donkey. The donkey is way out of place. So when Jesus comes riding into town on a donkey, I wonder if anyone in the crowd thought, obviously Jesus needs a new PR person because this is not how you make an entrance. You don't come into town as a conquering hero on a donkey and then expect everyone to really take you serious. Where's the chariot? Where's the prize stallion? Where's the military entourage? I wonder if there are some people in the crowd who are disappointed in Jesus' entrance. I bet there are, because Jesus doesn't enter the city in typical conquering hero fashion. And I think it's safe to say the disciples don't look like much of a military entourage. But Jesus doesn't choose to ride in on a chariot or gallop in upon a stallion like a typical conquering hero, because Jesus isn't typical, is he? He chooses a donkey. So you have to admit, this doesn't seem like much of an entrance. At first glance, it seems a little weak, actually. I mean, this would be the equivalent of the Queen of England pulling up to Buckingham Palace on a moped. So why? Why ride in on a donkey? Is it to show the people that he's not really a king? No, not at all. Jesus knows his rightful place as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He never denies the truth. He never denies his title as king. In fact, Jesus affirms it. The day Jesus is crucified, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Yes, I am." But then he tells Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world. So if Jesus is a king, then why ride in on a donkey? Because believe it or not, riding a donkey, just like riding a horse, is also something a king would do in ancient times. But it's only something a certain kind of king would do. What kind of king? A humble one. Listen to what the prophet Zechariah says in Zechariah 9:9. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus is a king. There's no doubt about it. The people sense it. But he's a humble king. Now they're trying to make Jesus into someone else, the type of king they want him to be. They want him to be victorious over the Roman armies. They want him to triumph over the emperor and Pilate and Herod. But that's not who Jesus is. And that's not why he comes into Jerusalem this day. Jesus comes into this city to conquer. He does. But he comes to conquer two things that no army, no general, no emperor, no ordinary man could ever conquer, no matter how strong they are or how hard they try. Jesus rides into Jerusalem to gain victory over sin and death and triumph over guilt and shame. And how will he conquer sin and death and guilt and shame? Through humility. Paul verifies this in Philippians 2:8 through these words. He, Jesus, humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Jesus is riding into town as king, but also with the greatest humility the world has ever seen or known. Jesus is the humble king. And how humble is he? Humble enough to not just lay down his cloak for humanity, but to lay down his life for us as well. And because of what Jesus did for us, because of his willingness to die for our sins, because of this ultimate act of humility on the cross that he endured just a few days after this triumphal entrance, God, as Paul says in Philippians 2, 9 through 11, God highly exalted Jesus and gave him the name that is above every name. So at the name of Jesus, every knee should bend, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. A few weeks from now, we will celebrate Palm Sunday. We will become a part of the crowd and will actively honor our humble King. On that Sunday, we'll be playing our instruments. We'll be shouting hosannas and waving our little palm branches in the air. In worship on that special day, we will be singing and praising our Lord. And we should, because if we don't, even the rocks will cry out, right? And we're definitely going to make sure our praises are heard over the rocks. On Palm Sunday, we're going to give Jesus the respect and honor he deserves because of who he is as King and because of what he's humbly done for us as our Savior. And this will be great. It will all be great. Jesus is King, and we should praise him in special ways on special days like Palm Sunday. But pulling out all the stops, rolling out the red carpet, or rolling out the barrel, so to speak, for Jesus once a year or even once a week just isn't enough. Not for this King. He deserves more, so much more. If we say that Jesus is our King, we must mean he's King over all of our lives, over our minds and our bodies, over our hearts and our souls, over our mouths and our ears and our eyes. And every day we should lay down our lives before him as if we are living cloaks. When we do, his kingdom comes into our lives in powerful ways, which is what we want, right? Do we want his kingdom to come? Of course we do, every day. So every day, let's invite the King to come into our lives. And every day, let's give our all to him. Jesus, our King, deserves our best. After all, he rode willingly on a donkey to give us his.
Okay, that was a lot to unpack. So first, let's go back to kind of the beginning. So what sort of king were the people expecting Jesus to be this day? And what kind of kingdom were they expecting him to establish?
Well, they wanted him to be a geopolitical, a military king.
And
He
take
wanted,
over?
he wanted him to be the next line of kings that were written about in the Old Testament, only better.
And what kind of kingdom were they looking for him to establish?
Well, the kingdom of Israel is what we call it today.
That would rule, they said this, that he would rule forever. And it was, like you said, it was geopolitical, take over Rome.
Right. Kick out the Romans, kick out any foreign, create your own land, your own kingdom.
I'm just going to bring this up too, because I think it helps to make it come alive. The Chosen, if you haven't watched it, just the Jews were always occupied, so that mindset of somebody they were not going to be occupied anymore was really strong.
Well, Israel wasn't occupied under King David. I mean, they're what they're calling for is the restoration of what's usually called the Davidic kingdom, like an independent, sovereign Israel.
And that's
King David united all the tribes into a united kingdom.
And so that the next question is, they proclaimed him the son of David. What is the significance of this title, and how might this has threatened the leaders of that time?
Well, certainly there was a lot of history of King David being a warring king. Certainly King David was involved in lots of battles successfully. And he pulled and united the whole territory. He united the 12 tribes. So if you're the Romans overlooking this hodgepodge of various peoples that are all scattered, as long as they stay scattered and squabbling among themselves, it's easier to control them. But if they find somebody to unite them that they can all get behind, they become a serious political threat to the establishment. And certainly, the Romans were concerned about it, but so were the Jews. The whole Pharisee issue. They recognized that he was a threat to their status quo.
Yeah. Thank you. Amazing summary.
Oops,
And-
did something wrong.
No, that was amazing. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, and to your point, we talked about this on Monday, the very first people that arrested him were the Jewish leaders. And then they tried to get Rome to take it over. So they were both wanting him gone.
Those in power do not like to lose the power.
That's true even today.
I think
Can anybody talk about January 6th?
I've often said that it's not the love of money, but it's that lust for power that is the most dangerous, because even in an abusive relationship, power is the goal with that person that's abusive. So it's not things or anything. It's that power over someone that is a very intoxicating element.
Mhm.
I don't know whether you want to go in this direction, but it does seem to be reading this passage again. You wind up realizing that the people who conspired to get rid of Jesus were right, in the sense of he was a mortal threat to them. And there was no possibility of any reconciliation or compromise with what he was a revolutionary figure, both politically and I suppose in terms of social justice. All of his radical talk about helping the poor. That's not what the establishment cared about.
Well, and you hit it, Paul. That's the title of this session, undermining the establishment. That's exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
So what is the significance of him riding into town on a donkey?
Well, I think that was the exact opposite of him coming in. As the speaker said, you're looking for parades, you're looking for the important figures coming in on noble steeds and the stallions and all that kind of stuff. That's sort of like him coming in a little, I don't know, a little Fiat, a Kia, something along that line, as opposed to that Rolls Royce.
What was his analogy? Does anybody remember? Because I wrote it down.
Queen Elizabeth showing up on a moped.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah, and
I don't even like that mental picture that
But one of the things that I can't remember the speaker's name, but one of the things that he talked about was passages in the Old Testament that foretold how this was appropriate. And he talked about humility and with the first one, he talks about Jehu, and then in the next one, he cites a passage from, I can't remember. I don't think it was Malachi, but it was
Zechariah.
another the passage about the humble king, the humble ruler will come on a donkey. And one of the things that I think is, so clear is that
I mean, Jesus had taught in the temple, and all the people that he was dealing with knew the Bible in the sense of, you know, all the Old Testament stories. And that's just one other thing that has crossed my mind about with David, that as a symbol, I mean, he didn't just unite things, but he was the underdog who united. I mean, David and Goliath, defeating somebody who had seemed to be unbeatable when he was a mere youth, so that that you didn't have to already have huge crowds behind you who are militarily armed in order to be militarily powerful. You just needed a slingshot.
True. And that passage is from Zechariah. And I think I love like the Gospel of Matthew, because he does this often. And I don't know which of the other Gospels do it, but he brings in the Old Testament. And he said, Jesus rode in on a donkey to fulfill what they said, what the prophet Zechariah said.
Mhm.
And he also said, and his disciples don't look like a military entourage. They sure didn't. And so you talked about humility, and that's exactly it. Jesus is the example of humility. And what was he coming in? He wasn't, and he says this, he wasn't coming in to conquer Rome. He was coming in to conquer two things. You're muted, Robin.
Sin and death.
And
Sin and death. Yep, and triumph over guilt and shame.
And I think it's really significant that he does have a lot of the population clearly supporting it.
Yeah.
They're throwing down their cloaks, and that shows that, you know, the political leaders don't necessarily represent everybody, or maybe even a majority of who's there on the ground.
Yeah.
But
So,
aren't these the same people, though, who not too much later are calling for his crucifixion?
Yeah.
Aren't we the people throwing down our cloaks and then shouting to have him crucified?
Yeah. Mobs are a pretty dangerous thing. They're kind of volatile. But
I know when after, go ahead, Carol.
On Monday, that was brought up too. And my thought was that because he ended up not being this huge conquering military leader, I think may have contributed to the crowd so easily turning against him.
But I feel like the Jewish leaders also incited the people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. If you've taken any psychology courses, there's a thing called mob mentality, that it's so easy to get caught up in that energy that comes with a crowd, plus the fact you feel like there's some anonymity in a crowd, so you can say and do things you would not do by yourself, as you're part of the crowd, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think about having gone to a football game where I was a student at Rice and we were playing LSU, and the guy in front of me was rooting vehemently for LSU until they started to lose, and then he started yelling for Rice. I thought, I mean, for me, that's just been a great example of not just a crowd, but of the fickle allegiance of a crowd. You know, it is true that one other part of that experience was that I'd never seen so much drinking at a football game in my life. But who knows, you know, that's another thing that, you know, when people were going into battle, when guys were going into battle historically, they were usually given some drink before they went in. I mean, it's not coincidental about getting people riled up that the little liquor can help get people's emotions flowing.
Liquid courage.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to be the devil's advocate for a moment in thinking about this. You know, if you imagine Jesus as a political activist who wants to accomplish something, and he's going to stage his entrance into the town at this moment of crisis, it's almost inevitable that he's going to take this approach. He's in no position to stage the traditional entrance. So instead, he stages an entrance that mimics a biblical precedent. And so, you know, was it modesty that led him to ride in on a donkey, or was it political calculation? It's possible to see it either way. I'm not saying that it should be seen as political manipulation, but in terms of how people at the time and ever since have thought about Jesus, you know, there is this kind of, if you will, ambiguity about the meaning of his actions.
And it could have been both.
Yes, it certainly could have been. I'm just saying it was the appearance is modest, but the calculation is well calculated. I'll put it that way.
Well, there again, though, he knew his Old Testament.
Oh,
and
yeah.
What it, so it could have been.
Seems like it's been borne out as a true message.
Say that again, Eric?
It seems like it's been borne out as a true message, whether calculated or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, Carol.
Well, it's a little bit of a
No, I agree with you.
sort of a what could be called a dog whistle, where the people who knew their Old Testament and saw it as playing out, just like you said, Paul, understood what he was doing.
Yeah.
And that it was an intentional way to proclaim his authority in a way that fulfilled the scriptures as well, and that those who knew the scriptures knew what that meant. So, yeah, like you said, Maria, it could be both. And
that would make it even more threatening to the powers that be. Very much so. I mean, that they were so self-satisfied with themselves on, quote unquote, obeying the law, the letter of the law, and making sure everyone followed the law. He was throwing it right back in their face.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I've said this before, but if you ever want to read an account of, it's a secular account of Jesus's last days, but it talks about how insightful he was, in INCITE, inciting things, and it's called Killing Jesus by Bill O'Reilly. It's just a fascinating, like, of just how they had no choice but to put him to death. But let's transition a little bit to the whole humility thing, because whether we believe that moment was largely politically motivated or humility motivated, Jesus did demonstrate humility in many of his, throughout his public ministry. And one of the things that the speaker said in the end is, we need to invite Jesus every day to be king over all of our lives, and we need to be, this was so beautiful, living cloaks, laying out our lives for Jesus every day. I really liked that, and every day inviting him into our lives. So, go ahead, Carol.
I found that statement, living cloaks, very, it very drawing. Yeah, that was very good.
Yeah, it's just funny, like you read these passages and you do these studies and then they draw something out that I've never heard that before. But so then how do we go about as to being Christ-like, how do we go about demonstrating humility on a daily basis? That's a tough question for me. Jesus and I have been working on humility since 2020, so we still got a ways to go.
We're all works in progress.
Well, every time I think I'm getting good at it, I realize I'm not at all.
I think of just hearing everybody out.
What was that?
I think of hearing everybody out,
Yeah,
you know, really making an effort to not jump to conclusions before you hear everybody out.
great point. Listening.
You know, and it may just be where I am in my journey now. I'm just trying to start each day in rhythm. And so what I mean by that is there's a certain kind of prayer time routine that I've started that I can really tell a difference when, like, I had a pinched nerve. That's why he was supposed to go to church on Sunday. I had a pinched nerve, so that's why I didn't go. But he didn't want me. He decided to stay.
It's pretty scary here.
Oh, it wasn't scary. I was just
Unconscious.
You can't do anything about it. You just have to wait. But anyway, so there were 2 days where I didn't do my routine, right? Because I was drugged and asleep and all that. So, but I could really tell a difference in just my when I say perspective, that sounds too narrow. It's in just kind of my how I perceive. I'm not even explaining this well. It's just
Yeah, you are.
it's a and I mean yeah, I'm not sure how to say it. It's just the way I feel in space. Let me say it that way, is different. And it's subtle. And so so that's where I am. I really can't quite respond to your question. I feel like it's too advanced for me. Okay.
No, I thought your answer was beautiful. And
but that's where I am.
I think those of us who try to start with a daily prayer routine understand exactly what you're saying. It makes a difference. It really does.
Yeah, and I really think of it as a rhythm, because it also helps me. I think I can be a little bit more forgiving of myself, and I can identify when I'm out of rhythm, right? So it's kind of like, am I in or am I out? And sometimes I can't tell I'm out until I have gone back to the routine. And then I'm like, oh no, I was out. I'm like, I was out, I mean, the way I was, the kind of my way of just being in space was not the same.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a new experience for me, probably since maybe August or September is when I've started this in a very particular way.
Well, that's very cool though. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you get up in the morning and or do it the night before, set your coffee maker up with your filter and put your grounds in and your water. It's like starting the day helps me filter out all the minutia and focus in on what's important. And when I don't do that, it's kind of like what you were just saying. It's almost like it's different. The perspective is different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Other thoughts on how we're called to be demonstrating humility?
Well, I guess for me, my understanding of humility is not so much what you do as what you don't do. To me, humility is the absence of pride.
Okay.
When I think of when we say Jesus was humble, I don't think he underestimated himself.
Mhm.
As we say, we know who he was and what his mission was and what his destiny was, and he knew that. And he didn't go around saying, "Oh, shucks, I'm not really that." He didn't, so to speak, hide his light under a bushel basket. But he wasn't arrogant. Here he is, the person who, if he wanted, could have summoned a great army to lead the parade. He doesn't. He behaves modestly and graciously, I would say. But in terms of humility, it's recognizing his own abilities, but not trumpeting them.
Mhm.
And
So we're all called to be of service. I mean, we saw Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And I think a big part of humility is having washed those feet, washing the feet of the people around you. You don't jump up and say, "Holy smokes, y'all, look at that. You see that stuff? Here I am. Look at all I did." I think humility is doing the work and then just keeping your mouth shut.
Yep.
It reminds me when you asked if we'd ever met anybody that was famous. I remember one time I was asked to walk Juan Williams, who was coming as a speaker from one place to another. And I told him that when I was, and he's the guy who's on a lot of panels on television as a commentator and wrote Eyes on the Prize, which has been, was on PBS. And I told him that I had used parts of that when I was teaching American history. And he was saying, "Oh, wow, well, thank you. Well, that's just so great." And for me, I think about that tied back to your question at the beginning. Have you ever met anybody who was famous? He was so just modest about, as opposed to saying, "Well, well, of course, because it's a great thing, and kids don't know stuff about it." I mean, it was just, "Oh wow, well that's I'm so happy to hear that," and I was so taken by his manner, and he's often the kind of token liberal on a conservative panel, and just I listen to him talk, and he usually has a nice way of making his point, but not sounding, I don't know, like he's trying to tell everybody else that he's the only one that knows anything. And of course, he's, if you're the minority, well, not just in terms of his ethnicity, but I mean, from his point of view, he's on one of the talk shows where he's the, the kind of the token liberal. But he always has just the nicest manner. And I think that's such a compliment to somebody who is in a position where they're well known.
Mhm.
I think that takes a certain kind of, this ties back into what both Paul and David were saying, is that why they did what they did. It's about service and being grounded in that, to where it isn't about turning the light on oneself or being insecure about it. Like, "Hey, look, I'm really great. You should follow me. Look,"
Yeah.
which is so, I loved how you framed it, David, because it just made me think about social media a lot. Just the way you did it, your delivery.
I'm a TikTok understudy.
Ah,
Well, he's a king who can be an example to his subjects. You know, if you're a conquering hero sort of king, your subjects can't do that, and you have a viable kingdom.
Mhm.
You
We-
know,
Talking about
he's got to be a first
Well-
citizen and not a, ruler.
when you were talking about Juan Williams, the thought, a gentleness about him
Mhm.
came to mind, and he really is a very gentle gentleman, for a lack of.
Mhm.
And when we're talking about all this, I said that just shows us how much God loves us to go to those, to the extent that he did, to show his love for us. And
Yes.
and it was, so very loving parent.
Yes, and we talked about service and lack of pride and listening, starting with prayer. Here's the challenge. This is going to be a good one. So reflect upon 3 acts of humility that are unfamiliar to you and then act upon them. So that's your prayer prompt for the week. It could be make a meal for a neighbor, do the dishes,
acts of
rub your
humility.
husband's feet, fold the laundry.
You wouldn't.
So
Would
it's just
have
in
thought of
your
doing
prayer
that.
time this week, pray about ways of humility that God is calling you to serve others that maybe a little bit out of your comfort zone.
Curious the way they phrased it. Acts of humility, not acts of service. I don't think of humility as a action. I don't think of humility as a verb
Mhm.
in the sense that, to me, humility is how you respond to something you did. That's curious phrasing the way they asked us.
Mm-hmm.
Acts of humility. Yeah, I got to think about that before I get started on anything else.
Okay, then. Well, I know it's 8 o'clock. I'm sorry. We're just now getting to prayers, but I think I know I'm going to take it into reflection on where's God calling me to humility this week, and in Lent.
Stop recording.
Stop recording. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, Nancy, I stole your thunder.